There's a type of suffering that doesn't come from a concrete loss, nor from an evident tragedy. It arises when you try to negotiate with life as if life were a contract. If I do everything right, nothing bad happens. It's a secret hope, almost childish, but dressed in adult clothes. And when reality breaks that promise that no one signed, the mind enters a state of vigilance. It starts looking for guarantees where there's only uncertainty, starts demanding control where there's only flow, starts requiring stability where the very nature of living is change. Worry is that, an attempt to control tomorrow using imagination as a defense tool. But imagination, when used to protect, becomes a factory of scenarios. It produces versions of the future like someone producing alarms. With each thought, a new possible threat. With each silence, a new interpretation. With each delay, a miniature catastrophe. And without realizing it, you start living more in the what if than in the here it is. Many call it prudence. Others call it responsibility. But there's a detail that reveals the truth. Worry doesn't bring clarity. It brings exhaustion. It doesn't improve action. It paralyzes or accelerates blindly. It doesn't strengthen character. It weakens serenity. And little by little, the person loses something precious. The ability to trust in their own journey. You might even recognize this pattern in the body. Breathing becomes short without reason. The chest tightens as if carrying a stone. The jaw hardens. The shoulders rise. The mind wakes up before the body, already arguing with the day. And when night comes, the bed turns into a meeting room where the future is debated urgently, as if sleeping were a dangerous luxury. Life keeps happening, but you're no longer fully in it. You're divided between what was and what might be, between what should have been and what might happen. And presence, which is where life really touches, becomes rare. The phrase "you can't control life" isn't a pessimistic warning. It's an invitation to maturity. Because suffering intensifies when you insist on controlling what wasn't made to be controlled. Time, people's reactions, the mood of those you love, the world's oscillations, the final outcome. The mind wants total security, but existence doesn't offer that package. It offers something more austere and at the same time more liberating, the chance to learn to live well even without guarantees. Carl Jung observed that much of our torment comes from the ego trying to govern everything. The ego wants to direct, decide, predict, maintain the image, avoid shame, avoid loss, avoid error. It feels responsible for protecting the identity you've built. And that seems noble until the moment you realize the price. The ego, when it becomes a tyrant, prevents life from teaching. It tries to prevent chaos but ends up preventing growth. And when growth is prevented for too long, life finds ways to force change. A crisis, burnout, a breakup, an emptiness that isn't cured with distractions. The Stoics, by another path, reached a similar conclusion. It's not the world that needs to be tamed. It's your judgment about the world. You don't control the storm, but you control how you position yourself in it. You don't control what happens, but you control what you do with what happens. That point is simple, but it requires discipline. Because the mind addicted to worry likes a specific illusion, that thinking all the time is a type of action. But thinking without direction is just anxiety in motion. Worry gives the sensation that you're preparing, when often, you're just hurting yourself in advance. Why does the mind do this? Because it's afraid of the unpredictable, and the unpredictable reminds us of something deeper: vulnerability. You love and might lose. You build, and it might collapse. You invest and it might not return. You take care of yourself and still get sick. You plan and still get surprised. Worry tries to cushion that truth, as if anticipating pain could reduce it. But the effect is usually the opposite. You suffer twice. You suffer imagining and suffer living. And sometimes you suffer imagining something that never happens. There are people who learned early to worry because they grew up in unstable environments. Worry became a radar, a way to predict mood changes, to avoid conflicts, to not be caught by surprise. For a child, that might have been survival. For an adult, it can become a prison. The same mechanism that once protected starts stealing peace. And the hardest part is that the person gets used to that tension as if it were normal. They call it, "That's just how I am." But being that way isn't destiny, it's a pattern. And patterns can be transformed with awareness. Jung would speak of the shadow, what you avoid recognizing in yourself. Often, worry is a way of not looking at emotions that seem dangerous. Fear, sadness, anger, a feeling of helplessness. Instead of feeling, you think. Instead of facing the wound, you calculate. Instead of admitting "I don't know," you try to build an artificial certainty. But the unconscious doesn't accept being ignored forever. It returns in the form of anxiety, irritability, restless dreams, somatizations, unexplained tiredness. The inner life demands recognition. And when you recognize it, something starts to reorganize. Worry also has a component of disguised vanity. The idea that, if you worry enough, you deserve a happy ending. As if mental suffering were a bargaining chip. But the universe doesn't work by automatic moral compensation. Good events happen and bad ones too. Just people get hurt. Reckless people sometimes prosper. Life isn't a court that distributes results proportional to your level of apprehension. Worry doesn't buy security. It just buys wear and tear. So why is it so hard to let it go? Because letting go of worry feels like letting go of the steering wheel. And no one likes feeling like a passenger. But there's another way to drive. Drive yourself. Instead of trying to control life, you learn to control your response. You learn to choose the next concrete attitude, not infinite rumination. You learn to distinguish preparation from mental torture. You learn to accept that there are things that will only be resolved with time, and that time doesn't speed up because you're anxious. There's a practical way to notice the difference. Preparation has a clear end. You plan, decide, take measures, and close it. Worry doesn't close. It repeats. It spins in circles, producing the same anguish with different words. And when you notice that circle, a direct question arises. What can I do now for real? If the answer is nothing besides waiting, then the necessary virtue is patience. If the answer is, I can talk, then the virtue is courage. If the answer is, I can set boundaries, then the virtue is firmness. If the answer is, I can take care of my body, then the virtue is temperance. Worry doesn't practice virtues. It practices control. Life doesn't ask you to be indifferent. It asks you to be lucid. Indifference is anesthesia. Lucidity is presence. Lucidity sees the risk without turning into panic. Lucidity recognizes pain without turning into despair. Lucidity knows that not everything depends on you, and precisely because of that chooses carefully what does. There's dignity in that. There's a silent strength in someone who doesn't need to control everything to remain whole. Maybe the central question is this: what are you trying to control so you don't feel vulnerable? Because when you find that answer, you start treating the root. And treating the root doesn't mean eliminating vulnerability. It means building a nobler relationship with it. You don't become invulnerable. You become more capable, more sober, more firm, less hostage. Throughout life, the mind learns that control gives a sensation of power. But maturity discovers that true power is something else. It's enduring uncertainty without losing direction. It's continuing to act with values even when the outcome is uncertain. It's not turning every possibility into a threat. It's accepting that life has tides, and that you can learn to swim without demanding the sea stop. When you stop worrying as a lifestyle, it's not because everything became easy. It's because you decided not to put your peace in the hands of the unpredictable. You decided to train your gaze, your judgment, your breathing, your inner posture. You decided not to give the anxious mind the right to narrate your existence as if it were a disaster movie. You chose to live in the real, with prudence and courage, instead of living in the imagined with fear and exhaustion. Worry rarely presents itself as it really is. It disguises itself as care. It wears the clothes of responsibility and speaks with the voice of prudence. It says, if I don't think about this now, it'll go wrong. It says, I need to anticipate so I'm not caught by surprise. It says, I just want to protect who I love. And yet, when you look with honesty, you realize that worry doesn't protect. It consumes. It doesn't solve. It repeats. It doesn't guide. It agitates. And, little by little, you lose your own center, like someone trying to hold water with their hands. There's a hard and liberating detail. Much of what you fear isn't in your hands, and much of what is in your hands isn't done with worry, but with simple, clear, and limited action. The anxious mind hates limits. It prefers unlimited torment to modest action. Because modest action has a built-in truth. This is what I can do. And admitting that means facing finitude, vulnerability, the lack of total control. For the ego, that seems like humiliation. For maturity, it's peace. The Stoics were relentless on this point. They didn't ask you to become a stone. They asked you to stop handing your inner freedom to what doesn't depend on you. And worry is exactly that. Inner freedom handed to the unpredictable. You wake up and you're already in debt to the future. You eat and you're already mentally arguing about what might happen tomorrow. You get a message and immediately imagine what it means. You look at a loved one and instead of presence feel a tightness, as if love needed to be guaranteed in advance. Worry doesn't let love be love. It turns love into vigilance. And why does the mind do this? Because worry gives a sensation of mastery. Not real mastery, but emotional mastery. I'm attentive, I'm prepared, I won't be naive. But over time, that mastery turns into slavery. Life becomes a control room with thousands of screens, and you try to monitor them all at once. The price is high: irritation, impatience, fatigue, trouble sleeping, trouble trusting, trouble feeling joy without guilt. The mind starts associating tranquility with danger, as if relaxing would give chance to bad luck. Jung would see this dynamic with psychological depth. Many worries aren't about what's happening, but about what's being touched inside. A small event can trigger an old wound. A silence can trigger a memory of abandonment. A criticism can trigger an entire story of devaluation. And then the ego runs to fix the future, trying to avoid feeling what's hurting now. In other words, worry often is an escape from a present emotion. You prefer to think 1,000 scenarios than admit, I'm scared. I'm insecure. I feel alone. I feel like I'm not enough. This mechanism is understandable. For many people, feeling was dangerous in the past. In certain environments, feeling was seen as weakness. In others, feeling was ignored. In others, feeling was punished. And then the person learns to replace feeling with control, not because they want to, but because it was the way they found not to crumble. But a survival resource, when it becomes a lifestyle, starts to corrode. And the mind, which once protected, starts to sabotage. It keeps you on alert even when there's no real threat. It interprets the world as constant risk. It creates a narrow life, where everything needs to be predicted. Here there's a decisive point. You don't need to eliminate worry all at once. You need to unmask it. You need to see when it's pretending to be useful. A simple criterion helps. Useful worry ends in a concrete and reasonable attitude. You check a document, schedule an appointment, make a call, organize a possible plan. After that, close it. Useless worry doesn't close. It continues, demanding more thought, more hypothesis, more control, as if repetition had magical power. It wants absolute certainty, and that certainty doesn't exist. The repetition becomes a vice, an attempt to numb insecurity with excess analysis. The Stoics would call this confusion between prudence and anxiety. Prudence is choosing carefully and acting with sobriety. Anxiety is trying to buy guarantees with mental tension. Prudence strengthens. Anxiety wears down. Prudence accepts reality as it is and works from it. Anxiety fights with reality and tries to force it to be something else. And fighting with reality is the quickest way to lose energy and lose joy. Jung would add another layer. When the ego tries to control too much, it also tries to avoid transformation. Because transformation requires crossing uncertainty. It requires dying to an old version of yourself. It requires admitting that certain paths no longer serve. Worry, then, works as a barrier. While you worry, you don't change. You stay stuck in an almost. Almost decide, almost talk, almost take a stand, almost start over. The mind prefers the known torment to the unknown change. And so life passes by outside while you remain arguing inside. But how to return to the axis without falling into passivity? Returning to the axis is returning to what depends on you. And what depends on you isn't the final outcome. It's the quality of your act. It's your character in action. It's your discernment. It's your daily discipline. It's your limit. It's your silence when speaking would just be emotional discharge. It's your courage when staying quiet would be cowardice. It's your patience when time can't be accelerated. It's your temperance when anxiety demands excesses. A concrete practice. When worry starts to grow, stop and ask, with inner firmness, what exactly is under my domain now? The word now is essential, because the anxious mind lives in the after. It wants to solve tomorrow today. It wants to avoid an imagined future pain. It wants to anticipate conversations, responses, scenarios. When you bring the question to the now, the field becomes smaller and more real. Maybe in the now you can only breathe, write a simple message, make a small decision, or accept that there's no possible action and what remains is to wait with dignity. Waiting with dignity is a rare virtue. It's acting inside when there's no action outside. Another practice. Observe the fantasy hidden behind the worry. Often the fantasy is, if I think enough, I won't suffer. But suffering is part of it. Worry doesn't remove suffering. It just anticipates and multiplies it. When you accept that with calm, something disarms. You start to understand that life isn't promising immunity, but it's offering maturity. And maturity isn't armor. It's a capacity to cross through. Jung would say that psychic life demands integration. If you try to live only with the strong, rational, and controlling part, the fragile, emotional, and vulnerable part will appear one way or another. It might appear as anxiety. It might appear as causeless irritation. It might appear as symptoms in the body. It might appear as repeated dreams. Integration starts when you admit, there's a part in me that fears. And instead of obeying that part as if it were the commander, you welcome it as a signal. A signal that something needs to be cared for, not controlled. This changes even the relationship with the future. You start to realize that it's not the future you fear, but the sensation of not being prepared for it. And true preparation is internal. It's developing courage, sobriety, flexibility, faith in your own capacity to learn. The person who trusts in their own journey doesn't need to control every curve. They drive with attention, but not with panic. They don't imagine an accident at every corner. They know they can handle it if something happens. That trust doesn't come from thoughts. It comes from practice. There's also a subtle moral aspect. Worry can become a way to punish yourself, as if you needed to pay for peace with anticipated suffering. There are people who feel guilty when they're calm, as if tranquility were irresponsible, as if life required tension to allow rest. That's a learned belief, not a truth, and it can be replaced by a more dignified posture. Do what's necessary with seriousness and then rest without guilt, because rest isn't escape, it's maintenance of the spirit. And when the mind insists, when it comes back with the same restlessness, you can train a simple, almost austere response. I've already done what I can for today. That phrase returns limits to the ego. It reminds you that you're human, not a god. It puts life back in its place. Life is bigger than your control. And that's not an insult. It's a relief. Because absolute control is an impossible burden. No one sustains that for long without breaking inside. Little by little, the focus changes. You stop asking how to guarantee everything will turn out right, and start asking how to live with righteousness whatever the outcome. That's a change of axis, and it's in that where worry loses strength. Not because the world became safe, but because you stopped demanding total security to live with dignity. You start to respect the unpredictable without kneeling before it. You accept that you don't control life, and exactly because of that, choose to govern yourself. There's a difference between planning and trying to prevent destiny. Planning is a human act. You organize what you can, choose probable paths, prepare resources, take care of what's within reach. Trying to prevent destiny is something else. It's demanding that life have no curves. It's asking time not to change people. It's wanting the world to behave like a closed system where, if you do A, you'll get B. Worry is born when that secret demand settles in. It works as a request for total predictability. And life by its own nature doesn't offer that. The problem is that for the ego, predictability isn't just comfort, it's identity. Many people build their own sense of value on top of being the one who controls. The person becomes the one who solves, who anticipates, who doesn't fail, who sustains others, who keeps everything running. And when something escapes the domain, the shake isn't just practical, it's existential. It's not just this went off plan, but who am I if I can't keep everything under control? That's why worry can be so stubborn. It's not defending just an outcome, it's defending an image. Jung would see here a conflict between the ego and something bigger within us. The ego wants external coherence, wants security, wants approval, wants continuity. But psychic life, in many moments, wants transformation. It wants you to grow beyond the character you had to wear. It wants you to become whole. And wholeness includes exactly what the ego avoids: vulnerability, doubt, imperfection, risk, loss, change. That's why so many people feel betrayed by life when a phase ends or when something crumbles. But, in a deeper reading, it might be life insisting that you not stay too small for your own soul. Worry, then, appears as an attempt to keep the ego in absolute command. It says, if I control, I don't change. And change scares. Change means losing references, losing certainties, abandoning habits, reviewing choices, maybe even reviewing relationships. Change means sometimes disappointing people who got used to your predictability. It means being seen in process and not as someone ready. The ego prefers the tension of control to the discomfort of transformation. The Stoics, without using that psychological language, also pointed to something similar. Suffering increases when you put your well-being in the hands of what's unstable. Whoever depends on praise to feel good will be a slave to praise. Whoever depends on recognition for peace will be hostage to recognition. Whoever depends on the outcome to maintain dignity will lose dignity when the outcome fails. Worry is a symptom of dependence on the unstable. You try to stabilize the unstable with the mind, but the mind doesn't have that power. And here comes a decisive idea. It's not uncertainty that destroys, it's resistance to uncertainty. Uncertainty can be bearable when you have principles. It becomes unbearable when you believe you can only live if you have guarantees. The person who demands guarantees lives as a prisoner because the world doesn't cooperate. The person who has principles lives with more freedom because they know their north even when the path is foggy. Worry also has an intimate relationship with guilt. Many worried people carry an old guilt, sometimes nameless. Guilt for not being perfect, guilt for failing, guilt for not being loved as they wanted, guilt for having anger, guilt for having their own desires. And then they try to compensate. If I worry enough, I'll be good enough. It's an attempt to pay an imaginary debt, but that debt never ends because it wasn't created by the real world. It was created by an internal judge, and the internal judge is voracious. It always finds one more reason to charge. Jung would call that judge a complex and internal structure that captures energy and repeats patterns. The inferiority complex, for example, can push you into constant worry. What if I'm not capable? What if I can't handle it? What if I'm exposed? The person even achieves but continues feeling threatened. Because the problem isn't the world, it's the wound that interprets the world. That's why often changing circumstances isn't enough. You change jobs, and worry changes clothes. Change cities, and worry travels along. Change relationships, and worry finds another reason. The root remains, an internal part that doesn't feel safe existing without control. And how do you build real security? Not with external guarantees, with an internal base. Stoicism calls this fortress of character. the capacity to keep the mind oriented by virtue, not by fear. Jung would call it individuation, the process of integrating denied parts and finding a deeper center than the social mask. In simple terms, real security is you becoming someone who can cross losses without losing yourself. This changes the way of looking at life. Instead of asking life to be totally predictable, you start asking to be more capable. Instead of begging for a future without pain, you start training a mind that doesn't disorganize easily. Instead of depending on external stability, you strengthen internal stability. And that's a silent revolution. There's a practical exercise that helps dismantle the ego's tyranny. Realize that most of worry's suffering is caused by stories. Stories you tell yourself. If this happens, it's over. If I lose this, I'm worthless. If this person drifts away, I won't survive. If I fail, it'll be eternal shame. Those thoughts seem realistic, but usually they're too absolute, too dramatic, too childish, even when they arise in an adult mind. The ego, when threatened, returns to absolute thoughts as if the world were black and white. And maturity's work is to return nuance. Ask yourself, is it really over? Won't I survive? Does my whole life depend on this? Is this fear proportional to the fact? Often the answer is no. You discover that part of your suffering comes from a tendency to catastrophize. And catastrophizing is a way of trying to prepare for everything. But preparing for everything is impossible. What's possible is preparing to respond with dignity, whatever happens. Another practice. Observe when worry tries to substitute a necessary conversation. Sometimes you worry about the relationship, but avoid talking clearly. You worry about money, but avoid looking at the numbers. You worry about health, but avoid doing the exam. You worry about loneliness, but avoid building bonds. Worry becomes a mental theater that seems productive, but it's a way of postponing the act. And when you replace worry with a small and concrete action, something changes immediately. The body relaxes a bit because the soul feels you're present. But what about when there's no possible action? When the person you love is sick and you don't control the outcome? When you're waiting for an answer that doesn't depend on you? When a phase is ending and you can't prevent it? There enters a rare type of virtue, active acceptance. Active acceptance isn't bitter resignation. It's the decision not to add revolt to what's already difficult. It's looking at the real and saying, I didn't choose this, but I can choose how to cross it. It's keeping the heart clean of the poison of why me, and replacing it with what's necessary now. The Stoics would call this amor fati, not a romantic love for suffering, but a deep acceptance of destiny as part of the world's fabric. Jung would call it surrender to the process, allowing psychic life to do its work, allowing a symbolic death to happen so another life can be born. In both, there's a common point. The ego needs to stop fighting the inevitable so the soul can breathe again. And here a simple image arises. Worry is like holding air in your lungs for fear of running out of oxygen. You hold, tense, control, and precisely because of that, you start to suffocate. Life asks the opposite. Inhale, exhale. Trust the rhythm. Not because there are no risks, but because the rhythm is wiser than the tension. What makes someone stop worrying isn't gaining total control. It's realizing, with depth, that worry isn't love, isn't prudence, isn't responsibility. It's fear trying to govern. And that, when fear governs, you lose the best of yourself. Clarity, presence, quiet courage. Worry tries to protect your life, but often steals life itself while you're still alive. There comes a time when the mind tires of being a sentinel. You might even keep functioning, keep working, keep fulfilling obligations, keep sustaining people and routines. But inside appears a wear that doesn't resolve with vacations, nor with distraction, nor with more planning. It's a deeper wear. The wear of trying to control life so you don't feel insecurity. And when you recognize that with honesty, you realize something simple and decisive. It's not the future that's crushing you. It's the attempt to dominate the future with thoughts. Life has a particular way of teaching us. It doesn't argue with our anxiety. It just keeps going. Time passes. People change. Cycles open and close. The body responds as it can. The world oscillates. And worry, no matter how insistent, doesn't alter those movements. It only alters you. It alters your breathing, your mood, your patience, your capacity to listen, to love, to rest, to notice beauty. It infiltrates the details and turns the everyday into a narrow hallway, where everything seems urgent and nothing seems safe. The point isn't to become someone indifferent. The point is to abandon an illusion that charges dearly. The illusion that thinking nonstop is synonymous with preventing. Maturity starts when you understand that preventing is acting with sobriety and after letting go. The rest is noise, and internal noise, when it becomes habit, turns into suffering. Stoicism offers an exit that doesn't depend on external promises. It doesn't promise that everything will turn out right. It teaches something more solid: how to stay whole when things don't turn out right. It returns you to what depends on you, your choices, your character, your posture, your judgment, your possible actions. It reminds you that serenity isn't a prize you win when life stabilizes. It's a training you build precisely because life doesn't stabilize. And Jung reminds you of another dimension. When the ego tries to control everything, it's not just trying to avoid problems. It's trying to avoid transformation. But transformation is a silent law of living. There are phases that end, even if you beg to stay. There are identities that wear out, even if you try to sustain the mask. There are paths that stop making sense, even if you cling to the habit. And when life pushes you to change, worry appears as resistance. But resisting the inevitable movement only increases suffering. When you finally accept, something in you reorganizes. You don't become weak. You become real. Deep down, the phrase "you can't control life" isn't a sentence. It's a liberation. Because if you can't control life, then you don't need to carry the weight of pretending you can. You can plan with honesty and still admit that the plan might change. You can love without turning love into vigilance. You can dedicate without turning dedication into blind self-sacrifice. You can care without torturing yourself. You can be responsible without living in a state of alert. Worry is usually a way of saying "I want guarantees." But life responds with silence because life doesn't sign guarantees. It offers something else. The chance to develop trust. Not trust that nothing will go wrong, but trust that you can cross when something goes wrong. That trust changes everything. It decreases despair. It reduces the compulsion to control. It returns the present to your hands. And the present is the only place where life really happens. Maybe today you can't abandon worry completely, and that's okay. The first step isn't to eliminate, it's to see. See the mechanism in action. Notice when the mind starts creating scenarios and ask, is this useful or is it torture? Notice when you're trying to predict so you don't feel and ask, what am I avoiding feeling now? Notice when you're demanding certainty and remember, I can choose clarity, even without certainty. Those small gestures are the start of a life wider inside. And there's an image worth keeping. Worry is like trying to hold a river with your hands. You wear yourself out, get frustrated, blame yourself, and the river keeps running. But if you stop fighting the river, you can learn to cross it. You can learn to choose where to step. You can learn to respect the current. You can learn to wait when it's dangerous to advance. And mainly, you can learn that you don't need to dominate the river to not drown. You need presence, humility, and practice. If this made sense to you, leave a comment saying what type of worry accompanies you the most. Health, family, work, money, loneliness, future. Like the video so more people find this reflection, share with someone who lives tired of thinking too much, and subscribe to the channel to continue deepening this path of clarity, inner strength, and serenity. When you're done, do just one simple thing. Close your eyes for a few seconds, breathe calmly, and repeat inside, with firmness, without hurry. I do what is mine, and I let go of what doesn't belong to me. This doesn't change the world at once, but it starts to change you.